The morning of December 23rd, 1944, broke clear and savagely cold over Boxted Airfield in eastern England. And that clear sky was the worst news the German Air Force would receive all week. Colonel David Schilling stood on the frozen hardstand beside his P-47 Thunderbolt, a club-swinging cartoon hillbilly painted across its nose, and tried to recall how much sleep he had actually gotten. Not much. Almost no one in the 56 Fighter Group had slept for a week. Fog had pinned them to the ground while German armies tore open the American line in the Ardennes. And there is nothing more dangerous than a fighter group with nothing to do. There had been cards. There had been bottles. Now the sky was open. He was 25 years old, a full colonel, and in 3 hours he would be badly outnumbered over Germany. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The legend that grew up around this day, the version passed hand to hand in officers' clubs for decades afterward, says that Dave Schilling climbed into his cockpit half in the bag, hung over to the edge of useless, and went out and shot down 5 German fighters anyway. It is the kind of story fighter pilots love, because it flatters the idea that a great pilot is great no matter what state he is in. The truth is more interesting than the legend, and it is also more believable. And to understand, you have to understand the man, the machine, and the particular madness of that week in December. Start with the war as it stood that morning. 7 days earlier, on December 16th, 1944, 3 German armies had come boiling out of the Ardennes forest in a snowstorm and caught the American line almost completely by surprise. It was Adolf Hitler's last great gamble in the West, a lunge meant to split the Allied armies and drive to the port of Antwerp. The Germans had timed it deliberately for foul weather, because foul weather was the one thing that could neutralize the Allies' single greatest advantage, their air power. For a week, the plan worked. Low cloud and freezing fog sat on the airfields of England and France, like a lid on a pot. The fighter groups that should have been shredding the German columns sat useless on their fields. Engines cold, pilots pacing. The men of the 56th understood exactly what their grounding was costing. Every day the weather held. German tanks pushed deeper into Belgium, and American soldiers froze and died in the Ardennes with no friendly aircraft overhead. The frustration in a fighter group during that week was a physical thing. You could feel it in the mess, in the way men drank a little harder and laughed a little louder, in the recklessness that creeps into young men who are being forced to wait while other men do their dying for them. 2 days before Christmas, in a war that had already swallowed most of their friends, the pilots of the 56 were wound as tight as men can be wound. So yes, there were parties. There were always parties. The 56 was famous for them. This was a group whose early days in England had included a drunken bicycle race through the barracks, and at least one occasion of pilots shooting up their own quarters with a service pistol. Fighter pilots in 1944 lived inside a simple and terrible arithmetic. The average life expectancy of a combat pilot was measured in missions, not years, and every man knew it. They drank because they were young, because they were frightened in a way they could never admit, and because tomorrow was not guaranteed to anyone. When the order came down late on the 22nd that the weather would break and the group would fly at first light, plenty of men went to bed with whiskey still in their blood. But here is the part the legend leaves out. Discipline in the air did not depend on how a man felt on the ground. The cold of a Thunderbolt cockpit at 30,000 feet, the pure oxygen flowing to the mask, the adrenaline of knowing the enemy was up there waiting. These things have a way of burning the fog out of a man's head with frightening speed. Whatever Dave Schilling carried with him to the hardstand that morning, by the time he was at altitude, he was the most dangerous pilot in the sky. The question this story really answers is not whether a hungover man can fly. It is how one pilot, leading from the front, could throw himself in a formation that outnumbered his own element many times over and come home without a mark on him. To answer that, you have to know who David Carl Schilling was. He had been born in Leavenworth, Kansas, in December of 1919, which made him a few days short of his 25th birthday on the morning this story takes place. He was a Dartmouth man, college-educated in an Air Force that still ran heavily on farm boys and mechanics, and he had enlisted for pilot training back in 1939, before most Americans believed they would ever be in this war at all. He was one of the original members of the 56 Fighter Group, there from the beginning, and he had risen through it the hard way, Squadron commander to group executive officer to, finally, in August of 1944, command of the entire group. He had inherited that command from a legend. The 56 had been built and shaped by Colonel Hubert Zemke, the man whose name the group still wore, Zemke's Wolf Pack, the most feared American fighter outfit in Europe. Zemke had invented the very tactics that made the group lethal, including the maneuver pilots called a Zemke fan, in which the group would fly to a known landmark inside its patrol zone, and then fan its squadrons outward across a wide arc, so that no matter where the German fighters came from, a piece of the Wolf Pack could turn and meet them. When Zemke was transferred to another group in August, command passed to Schilling. Then, in October, Zemke himself was lost, the wing of his aircraft torn off in violent turbulence over Germany, the great ace floating down into captivity. The Wolf Pack was Schilling's now, fully and finally, and he intended to lead it the way Zemke had. From the front, in the first airplane into the fight, he looked the part of the dashing fighter colonel almost to the point of parody. His Thunderbolt, named Hairless Joe, after a club-toting hillbilly character from the Lil Abner comic strip, wore a snarling tiger shark mouth along the cowling, a bright band of color, and that grinning cartoon brute on the nose. It was, by any sober military standard, a ridiculous thing to carry into combat, but there was nothing ridiculous about the man flying it. Schilling was a natural leader, flamboyant and fearless, the kind of officer who inspired devotion because he never asked his pilots to go anywhere he would not go first. He was also, by temperament, a daredevil, a man who genuinely seemed to need the edge of danger to feel fully alive. That trait would make him magnificent in 1944. It would also, years later, kill him. But that is the end of the story, and we are still at the beginning. This was not the first time Schilling had stared down impossible odds. 8 months earlier, on the 9th of April, 1944, on a bomber escort mission deep over enemy territory, he had become separated from his entire group except for a single wingman, alone, with one other Thunderbolt for company. He had sighted a formation of between 30 and 35 German fighters and attacked anyway. For that piece of cold nerve, he had been awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest decoration for valor. So when the story of December 23rd describes a pilot hurling himself at a swarm of enemy aircraft, understand that this was not a lucky accident or the false courage of a man too drunk to know better. It was simply how Dave Schilling fought. He had done it before, sober, and survived. Now consider the machine. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was the largest, heaviest single-engine fighter of the war, so big and barrel-chested that the men who flew it called it the Jug. When the first Thunderbolts arrived in England, German pilots reportedly laughed at them, radioing that the Americans were flying barrels. They stopped laughing very quickly. The Jug was built around a massive turbocharged Pratt & Whitney radial engine, and that turbocharger gave it tremendous power at high altitude, exactly where the bombers flew, and exactly where the fighting was decided. It could outdive anything in the sky. A Thunderbolt in a power dive could approach the speed of sound closely enough that pilots had to be careful the propeller tips did not tear themselves apart. It rolled beautifully, and it could absorb a beating that would have torn any lighter fighter to pieces, a quality that had already brought home hundreds of pilots who, in a lesser airplane, would have died. Its teeth were 8 machine guns, for in each wing, every one of them a .50 caliber Browning, a bore half an inch across, firing a stream of metal that could saw a German fighter in half in a 1-second burst. 8 of them, converging at a few hundred yards, produced a wall of fire that simply did not need to last long to be fatal. By the end of 1944, every other fighter group in the 8th Air Force had traded its Thunderbolts for the sleeker, longer-range P-51 Mustang. The 56 alone refused. They had learned the Jug. They trusted the Jug, and they were the last group in the 8th still flying it into combat on the morning of December 23rd. That stubbornness was about to pay one of its largest dividends of the entire war. The enemy that day will be flying something new and dangerous. Among the German formations climbing over the Ardennes were the latest Focke-Wulf fighters, the long-nosed FW-190D model, redesigned with more powerful inline engine for better performance at high altitude. The Germans had been hoarding aircraft and fuel for weeks, holding their strength back for the great offensive, and now, with the weather finally clear, they were committing it. The skies over the battlefront on the 23rd of December would be more crowded with airplanes than they had been in months. Both sides knew the stakes. For the Americans, clear weather meant the chance to finally bring their overwhelming air power down on the German spearheads. For the Luftwaffe, it meant one last opportunity to prove they could still contest the sky. It was going to be an enormous fight, and the Wolfpack was flying straight into the middle of it. If you find the story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Thunderbolts of the 56th lifted off from Boxstead into that hard, clear morning and climbed eastward toward the continent. Their job was bomber escort and patrol over the battle area, covering the heavy formations that were finally able to strike the German supply lines feeding the Ardennes offensive. Schilling led from the front, as always, Hairless Joe at the head of the group, his squadron spreading into their familiar pattern as they crossed into hostile airspace. Below and ahead of them, somewhere in the layered winter cloud, the Luftwaffe was rising to meet the day. And then, almost immediately, the fight began to slip through Schilling's fingers. Ground controllers vectored him toward enemy formations, and twice he chased them straight into the clouds and lost them. Whole groups of German fighters dissolving into the gray before his guns could reach them. For a fighter pilot, and especially for a group commander responsible for finding the enemy and bringing his men to battle, there are few things more maddening. Schilling keyed his radio and let the controllers hear about it, his frustration crackling across the channel. He had not waited out a week of fog and flown all the way to Germany to grope blindly through cloud while the war happened somewhere else. The reply that came back was almost offhand, and it would turn out to be one of the great understatements of the air war. Do not worry about it, the controller told him. There is bigger game on this heading. There was. As Schilling pressed on along the vector he had been given, the cloud began to thin, and what lay beyond it stopped the breath in his chest. Below him was a large enemy formation, and ahead of him, stacked across the sky, were more than 40 more, a great mass of German fighters, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulf together, including the new long-nosed machines, all of them climbing and turning with the unmistakable purpose of an attack about to be launched against the American bombers. 40-plus enemy aircraft. It was exactly the kind of moment that had defined Schilling's entire war, only larger than any of them. He had taken on 30-odd alone, with a single wingman in April, and lived. Now he had his whole group behind him, and a target richer than any he had ever seen. He did not hesitate. In the span of a few seconds, the group commander made his plan and called it over the radio. He sent 2 of his squadrons, the 61st and the 63rd, diving down onto the lower formation, and then, with the remaining squadron, the 62nd, his own old command, the men he knew best, he swung wide and brought them around behind a larger group of more than 40 that was flying on ahead, unaware that the Wolfpack was sliding into the one position from which a Thunderbolt was deadliest, above and behind, with the advantage of surprise and the long dive of the jug still in hand. Hairless Joe leveled out into its run. Below and in front of Schilling, dozens of German fighters filled the windscreen, close enough now to count, close enough to see the markings. His thumbs settled near the gun switch. 850 caliber barrels waited in the wings. In a few more seconds he would open fire, and over the next several minutes a 25-year-old colonel, the man the legend says could barely stand up that morning, would carve his name into the short, exclusive list of American pilots who became aces in a single day. But all of that was still in front of him. For one held breath, there was only the cold, the roar of the engine, the enemy filling the sky, and the oldest question in air combat hanging over the whole scene. Who has seen whom? The Germans had not seen them. That was the whole war, decided in that one fact. Schilling brought the 62nd Squadron down out of the high winter haze and into the rear of the enemy formation before most of the German pilots understood that the sky behind them had filled with thunderbolts. This was the moment every fighter pilot trained and prayed for, to arrive unseen, with altitude and speed in hand, behind an enemy who believed himself the hunter. The jug was at its best here. Heavy, fast in the dive, steady as a gun platform. It came down on the German rear like something dropped from a great height, and Schilling picked his first target out of the mass ahead of him and bored straight in. He opened fire at close range. 850 caliber barrels lit up the wings of Hairless Joe, and the converging streams of fire walked into a Messerschmitt before its pilot ever broke. There is no graceful way to describe what 8 heavy machine guns do to a single-engine fighter at a few hundred yards. The German aircraft came apart under the weight of it, shedding pieces, trailing smoke, falling out of formation in the first seconds of the fight. 1. The enemy formation, which a moment earlier had been an orderly mass climbing to slaughter American bombers, convulsed as the realization spread that they were being killed from behind. Discipline dissolved into the oldest instinct in the sky. Fighters broke in every direction at once. Some dove, some climbed, some rolled away. The neat formation became a swirling, scattering cloud of individual airplanes, each one suddenly fighting for its own life. In that chaos, a P-47 with energy in hand, and a steady pilot behind the guns was death itself. Schilling did not chase the panic. He worked the fight the way a veteran works it, picking targets of opportunity, using the Thunderbolt speed to slide from one to the next, never letting himself get slow, never letting himself get fixed on a single kill long enough for someone else to climb onto his tail. A second German fighter crossed in front of him, and he fired again, and again the guns did their brutal arithmetic. 2. Now the long-nosed Focke-Wulf were in it. The newest, most capable machines the Germans had put up that day, the FW-190 model rebuilt for a high altitude that the Luftwaffe had been hoarding for exactly this kind of moment. Schilling went after them. The next several minutes of his war do not survive in a neat second-by-second record, the way some famous dogfights do. What survives is a tally, and the tally is staggering. Across that single swirling engagement, David Schilling shot down 5 German aircraft, 2 Messerschmitt 109s, and 3 of the Focke-Wulf 190s. He fired, he killed, he repositioned, he fired again. 3, 4, and then a 5th enemy fighter felled the guns of Hairless Joe, and a 25-year-old colonel from Leavenworth, Kansas, became an ace in a single day. It is worth pausing on what that phrase actually means, because it gets used loosely. To become an ace at all, 5 confirmed aerial victories over the course of a combat career place a pilot in a small and respected fraternity. To score 5 in one mission, in one fight, in a matter of minutes, was something almost no one managed. Out of the entire United States Army Air Forces, across every theater of the Second World War, only 38 pilots ever did it. Schilling joined that list on the 23rd of December, 1944. He was already an ace several times over. This was simply the day he did in a few minutes what most aces took a year to do, if they survived long enough to do it at all. And he was not alone in his success. The plan he had called in those few seconds before the attack, sending the 61st and 63rd down onto the lower formation while he swung the 62nd behind a larger group ahead, worked across the whole group. The Wolf Pack fell on the Luftwaffe from multiple directions at once, and the result was one of the most lopsided air battles the 56th ever fought. When the sky finally emptied and the Thunderbolts turned for home, the group had shot down 32 German aircraft. 32 in a single mission. The German formation that had climbed up that morning intending to butcher American bombers had instead been butchered itself, and the bombers that had been sent to destroy went on to their targets largely unmolested. Somewhere in that falling rain of wreckage was a man worth remembering on the other side. Among the German pilots who did not come home on the 23rd of December was a Luftwaffe ace credited with very nearly 100 aerial victories. One of the most experienced fighter pilots in the entire German Air Force, a holder of the Knight's Cross, a man who had survived years of combat against impossible numbers of his own. He was killed that day. It is possible, though it has never been proven beyond doubt, that he fell to Schilling's guns. If he did, then the arithmetic of that morning was even crueler than it looked. A veteran of nearly 100 victories, shot out of the sky by a hungover American the legend says could barely walk to his airplane. Whether or not the two men ever actually met in that swirl of fighters, the larger truth holds. The German pilot's vast experience meant nothing against surprise, altitude, and 850 caliber guns. That was the entire story of the air war over Germany by the end of 1944, compressed into a single morning. Skill could not save you when the other side had everything else. Schilling brought Hairless Joe home to Boxstead without a scratch. Not the airplane riddled in trailing smoke, not the pilot bleeding into his harness. Both of them whole, the great rugged jug carried him back across the cold gray channel exactly as it was built to do. He had thrown himself at a formation of more than 40 enemy fighters, destroyed 5 of them with his own guns, and walked away from his cockpit on his own 2 feet. The men who had partied beside him the night before, the men who told the story for years afterward, did not have to exaggerate anything. The facts were already taller than any tale they could have invented. For this, his second such feat of the war, Schilling received a second award of the Distinguished Service Cross, an oak leaf cluster to the decoration he had earned back in April for the lonely fight against 30-odd Germans with a single wingman. The citation spoke of extraordinary heroism in aerial combat. It did not, of course, mention whiskey or the week of fog, or the recklessness of young men 2 days before Christmas. Those things stayed where they belonged, in the unofficial history of the group, in the stories. What went into the record was the part that could be confirmed. 5 enemy aircraft destroyed, an attack pressed home against overwhelming odds, a group commander leading from the front. That phrase, leading from the front, was the real key to the whole thing, and it is why this is not just a story about one good day. Schilling did not order his men into that fight from a safe position and tallied the results afterward. He was the first airplane into the enemy formation. He took the worst of the risk himself. His pilots fought the way they did on the 23rd of December because the man telling them to do it was doing it ahead of them, in a Thunderbolt with a cartoon hillbilly painted on the nose. Morale in a fighter group is not built with speeches. It is built by a commander who is visibly, repeatedly willing to die alongside the men he commands. The 32 kills the Wolfpack scored that day were, in a real sense, a reflection of the man at the head of the formation. The 56 carried its momentum to the end of the year, and into a milestone no other unit had reached, counting both the enemy aircraft shot down in the air and those destroyed on the ground in strafing attacks. The group became the first American fighter group of the entire war to be credited with more than 800 aircraft destroyed. 800. They had done it as the last holdouts in the 8th Air Force, still flying the Thunderbolt, the heavy barrel-shaped fighter the Germans had once laughed at, while every other group had long since switched to the Mustang. The Jug had vindicated the men who refused to give it up. In the first days of January 1945, the 56 finally began receiving an improved Thunderbolt, the P-47M, built to be the fastest piston-engine fighter the Allies ever fielded, a final, faster version of the airplane the group had trusted from the beginning. Schilling flew his last documented combat mission a few days into January and relinquished command of the group on the 27th of that month. His combat tour complete, he had flown 132 combat missions across 2 tours. His final account stood at 22.5 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air, with another 10.5 destroyed on the ground, making him the 6th highest scoring ace in the entire 8th Air Force and the 3rd ranking ace of the Wolfpack itself. He had survived the deadliest job in the deadliest theater of the air war, a job that had killed Zemke's chances of finishing the war free, that had killed 3 majors in his sister group in a matter of weeks, that had killed most of the men who started the war alongside him. He had survived being outnumbered 8-1 and worse, more than once on purpose. The Luftwaffe, at the height of its strength and again in its long decline, had thrown everything it had at David Schilling for the better part of 2 years. It never touched him. He stayed in uniform after the war, and he became something more than a wartime ace. He became one of the men who dragged American air power into the jet age. In 1948, with the Soviet Union blockading Berlin and the world holding its breath, Schilling led a mass flight of jet fighters across the Atlantic Ocean to Germany, a show of force meant to tell Moscow that American air power could reach Europe whenever it chose. It was called Foxable, and it was a genuine feat of navigation and nerve at a time when crossing the Atlantic in a jet fighter was a dangerous novelty. 2 years later, in 1950, he flew from England to the United States non-stop, the first non-stop transatlantic crossing ever made by a jet fighter, kept aloft by aerial refueling, proving that a fighter could now strike across oceans. The daredevil from Leavenworth, the man who had needed the edge of danger to feel alive, had found ways to keep finding that edge in peacetime. He helped turn the fighter from a short-range offensive weapon into something with global reach. A base in Kansas would eventually carry his name. He had become, by any measure, one of the most decorated and important fighter pilots his country ever produced. Which brings us, finally, back to the legend we started with. and to the ending no one who watched them fight in 1944 would ever have predicted. On the 14th of August, 1956, on a narrow two-lane country road in England, between two Royal Air Force stations used by the American Air Force, David Schilling was driving a Cadillac Allard sports racing car. He loved fast cars the way he had loved fast airplanes. He and a small circle of fellow enthusiasts, including, of all people, the formidable General Curtis LeMay, had bought the races to compete in sporting events. The same temperament that had made him hurl a Thunderbolt at 40 German fighters made him a man who could not resist the throttle on that quiet English road. The car left the pavement, and Colonel David Schilling was killed instantly. He was 36 years old. Read that again and let the irony of it settle, because it is the whole point of the story. The Luftwaffe could not kill him. More than 40 enemy fighters in a single morning could not kill him. 132 combat missions could not kill him. Years of being deliberately, repeatedly outnumbered over hostile territory could not kill him. The deadliest pilots in the world, in the deadliest skies of the war, tried for 2 years and failed. And then a sports car on a peaceful country lane, 11 years after the shooting stopped, did in an instant what all of them together could not. The thing that made him a great combat pilot, the appetite for speed and risk that let him do what ordinary men could not, was the same thing that, in the end, took his life. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, where the great soldiers of the Republic rest. The following year, an Air Force base in Salina, Kansas, not far from where he was born, was renamed Schilling Air Force Base in his memory. His Thunderbolt lives on in museum replicas. The ridiculous cartoon hillbilly still grinning on the nose, a reminder that the men who did the most serious work of that war were often very young, very alive, and not nearly as solemn as the monuments make them look. So was he drunk that morning? The honest answer is that it does not finally matter, and the legend by Fixé on it gets the man exactly backward. The story is not that a drunk pilot got lucky. Whiskey does not give a man 5 kills against 40 enemy fighters. Whiskey gives a man a headache and a slow reaction time, and the sky over Germany did not forgive slow reactions. What gave David Schilling that morning was everything underneath the legend. The years of training, the tactics Zemke built and Schilling perfected, the 850 caliber guns of the Thunderbolt arriving unseen out of high haze, the cold professional habit of leading from the front, and the bone-deep nerve of man who had already taken on 30 Germans alone and come home. Whatever he carried up with him from a night before burned off in the first cold breath of oxygen at altitude, the way it always did, and what was left was simply one of the finest fighter pilots his country ever produced, doing the thing he had been built and trained and tempered to do. The men who threw the parties knew that. The men who told the story over the years knew it too. They told the drunk pilot version because it was funny and because it was true around the edges, but they never doubted for a second what they were really describing. They were describing a leader, a man who went first, a man the enemy could not kill no matter how hard or how often they tried, who survived the unsurvivable and then was taken, almost as an afterthought, by an ordinary road on an ordinary summer day. That is the part worth carrying out of the story, not the bottle. The man, David Schilling, rests at Arlington now, and has for the better part of 70 years. Most people who pass his grave have never heard his name, never heard about the morning he took the wolf pack down out of the winter sky onto 40 German fighters and walked away from it without a scratch. You just did. That counts for something. It is worth stepping back from a single airplane and the single morning to see what that day actually belonged to, because the 23rd of December, 1944, was not only Schilling's day, it was the day the weather turned. And the day the weather turned was the day the Battle of the Bulge quietly began to be lost by the men who had started it. Hitler had built his entire Ardennes gamble on cloud. The offensive had jumped off on the 16th of December under a thick gray ceiling precisely because that ceiling kept Allied aircraft on the ground. For a week, it worked exactly as planned. German armor moved almost as it pleased, columns of tanks and trucks and fuel bozers crawling westward to the snow with nothing in the sky to punish them. On the American side, the frustration reached all the way up the chain of command. In the Third Army, General Patton famously had his chaplain compose a prayer for clear weather and had it printed and handed out to soldiers, an open admission that the one thing the Americans needed most was something no general could order, a break in the sky. The break came on the 23rd. The high pressure that froze the men of the 56th on their hard stand at Boxted was the same high pressure that scoured the clouds on the entire front. And when it did, the full weight of Allied air power came down on the Ardennes all at once. Transport aircraft finally dropped supplies to the surrounded paratroopers holding the crossroads town of Bastogne. Fighter bombers found the German columns strung out across open, snow-covered country with nowhere to hide and worked them over without mercy. The same offensive that had depended on bad weather to survive was now exposed to the clearest skies in a week, and the airplanes the Germans had kept at bay for 7 days arrived all together, furious at having been made to wait. Schilling's enormous victory was one bright thread in a much larger tapestry of destruction that unfolded over those clearing days, and together those days broke the back of the German advance. Look, too, at what it cost the Luftwaffe to come up and meet them. By the end of 1944, the German Air Force was a dying thing wearing the uniform of a living one. Its fuel was running out. The same synthetic oil plants the American bombers kept hammering were the reason German fighters were rationed gasoline and German trainee pilots were rationed flying hours. Its veterans were mostly dead, and the young men sent up to replace them arrived in their cockpits with a fraction of the training an American pilot received before he ever saw combat. When the Luftwaffe threw more than 40 fighters into the sky over the Ardennes that morning, it was spending capital it could never earn back. The Americans could lose pilots and replace them from a training pipeline that never stopped. The Germans could not. Every one of the 32 aircraft the Wolfpack shot down on the 23rd of December represented a machine that would not be built again, and, more often than not, a trained man who could not be replaced. That is a harder, colder meaning underneath the dogfight. Schilling and his men were not merely winning a fight. They were helping to bleed a doomed Air Force white, one clear morning at a time. The experience that the German veterans had spent years accumulating could not be passed on fast enough to the boys taking their place. And against surprise and numbers and the 8 guns of the diving Thunderbolt, experience alone was never going to be enough. The day that made Dave Schilling an ace in a single morning was, in miniature, the whole story of how the air war over Europe ended. Not in one decisive battle, but in 1,000 mornings exactly like this one, in which a fading enemy came up to fight and did not come back down. David Schilling rests at Arlington National Cemetery now, and has for the better part of 70 years. Most people who pass his grave have never heard his name, never heard about the morning he took the Wolfpack down out of the winter sky onto 40 German fighters and walked away from it without a scratch. You just did. That count for something. The Wolfpack that Schilling handed over at the end of January 1945 was not quite the same group he had led on to those 40 German fighters a month earlier, and the difference is something about how the war ended for everyone, winners included. Command passed to Lieutenant Colonel Lucian Dade, and with the new year came a new airplane. The group, still the only Thunderbolt outfit left in the 8th Air Force, began trading its faithful P-47D models for the P-47M, a final, sharpened version of the Jug, stripped down and tuned for raw speed, built specifically to run down the new German jets and the flying bombs that nothing slower could catch. On paper, it was the fastest piston-engine fighter the Allies ever sent to war, capable of better than 470 miles an hour in level flight, and the men who had spent 2 years defending the heavy Thunderbolt against everyone who sneered that it was a flying barrel finally had a barrel that could outrun almost anything in the sky, and then it began killing them. The new engine started failing in the air, not from enemy fire, not from anything a pilot could turn and fight, but from a flaw buried inside the machines themselves. Thunderbolts that had carried men home to the heaviest flak in Europe suddenly went silent over England, their great radio engines quitting on training flights and routine patrols. Pilots were killed in accidents that had nothing whatever to do with the Luftwaffe. The group was grounded while mechanics tore the engines down to find the cause, and what they found was almost insulting in its smallness. Rust. The powerful engines had been improperly sealed for the long sea voyage across the Atlantic, and the damp ocean air had worked its way inside during the crossing and quietly corroded the pistons. The fastest fighter in the Allied arsenal had been undone not by German cannon, but by salt air and a packing mistake. Engines had to be replaced wholesale before the men could trust the airplane again. There's a bitter lesson folded into that, It belongs in this story precisely because it rhymes with the way Schilling himself would one day die. These were men who had volunteered for the deadliest job in the deadliest sky of the entire war. They had faced the best the enemy could put into the air and beaten it day after day for 2 years. And in the final months, with victory no longer in any real doubt, some of them died anyway, to weather, to mechanical failure, to the 1,000 ordinary hazards of flying high-performance machines that kill pilots in every Air Force, whether or not anyone was shooting at them. The enemy was never the only thing trying to kill a fighter pilot. Toward the end, it was not even the most dangerous thing. The Wolfpack worked through the trouble the way it worked through everything else, and flew the new Thunderbolt in combat to the last weeks of the war, chasing jets and tearing apart what remained of the German military as the Reich collapsed inward from east and west. When the shooting finally stopped in May of 1945, the 56 Fighter Group stood as the highest-scoring fighter group in the 8th Air Force, a record built over 2 long years and never surpassed by anyone, and had compiled that record while flying, almost alone, the very airplane the rest of the 8th had given up. The Thunderbolt itself went on to become the most produced American fighter the whole war, more than 15,000 of them rolling off the lines, and it served in every theater, in the air and down on the deck, as escort and bomber killer and tank buster, long after the elegant Mustang had taken most of the headlines home. The men of the 56 never minded the lack of headlines. They knew exactly what the Jug had done for them. They knew how many of them had climbed, whole and breathing, out of cockpits that should by every reasonable expectation have been their coffins. Dave Schilling had been one of those men, over and over again, and on the 23rd of December he had taken that ugly, magnificent, club-nosed airplane straight into the heart of the German Air Force and brought it home without a scratch. The airplane had earned its keep. So had the man. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now. And don't forget to subscribe.